Hello, my friend. I hope today has not asked too much of you. Perhaps your mind has spent the last several hours juggling work that refused to end conversations that replayed themselves long after they finished, or responsibilities that somehow multiplied the moment you believed you had completed them all. If sleep has been reluctant to arrive, you are in kind company. Human beings have always found surprisingly inventive reasons to stay awake. Some of us worry about emails. Others worry about tomorrow's meetings. A medieval farmer, meanwhile, might have spent the evening wondering whether invisible visitors would approve of the small bowl of milk quietly waiting outside his front door. Stress, it seems, has always possessed remarkable creativity, so allow your shoulders to soften. Let your jaw relax. Breathe a little more slowly than you did a moment ago. Tonight, we wander into a forgotten medieval village where ordinary families ended each day with one of history's strangest bedtime routines, carefully placing bread, milk, or ale beyond their own doorstep for guests they hoped would never actually knock. To modernize, the scene appears almost theatrical. Imagine finishing supper, extinguishing most of the candles, checking that the livestock have settled for the night, then deliberately carrying perfectly good food outside and leaving it unattended until morning. It sounds like an invitation to hungry cats, ambitious mice, opportunistic dogs, or perhaps that one neighbor whose moral standards become unusually flexible after sunset. Yet for countless ordinary people across medieval Europe, this quiet ritual made complete sense. The food was rarely considered wasted. It was considered insurance. Insurance against what depended very much upon where one happened to live. In one village, the unseen recipient might be thought of as a household guardian who appreciated respectful treatment. A few valleys away, exactly the same bowl of milk might be intended for wandering ancestral spirits, visiting familiar homes beneath the cover of darkness. Elsewhere, people whispered about mysterious little beings who rewarded generous households while punishing selfish ones with broken tools, sick livestock, spoiled butter, or mysteriously vanished chickens. Medieval Europe was wonderfully united in one peculiar conviction. The night belonged to forces that daylight politely ignored. This belief feels surprisingly foreign only because modern life has become astonishingly successful at banishing darkness. Electric lights flatten midnight into something resembling late afternoon. Street lamps chase away shadows that once stretched between cottages like living creatures. Refrigerators preserve food without ceremony. Locks provide reassurance that once depended upon prayers, yet remove electricity-paved roads, emergency services, weather forecasts, and every comforting hum of modern technology. And the medieval night begins making uncomfortable sense. Darkness was not merely an absence of sunlight. It was an entirely different world. When the last rays disappeared beyond distant fields, visibility collapsed into islands of candlelight. Forests became walls of blackness. Familiar roads vanished beneath uncertainty. Sounds traveled farther than shapes. A barking dog carried farther than a burning lantern. Wind moving through branches became strangely articulate. Every unexplained noise invited interpretation, because explanation itself remained scarce. Human imagination has always disliked unanswered questions. The medieval imagination simply possessed more opportunities. Picture an ordinary village shortly after sunset during the 13th century. Smoke rises lazily from thatched roofs before dissolving into the evening sky. Children have already been called indoors because respectable parents knew that darkness encouraged adventures no child should pursue. Chickens settle onto their perches with enviable confidence, apparently unaware that humans continue arguing about invisible beings. Cows shift quietly inside wooden shelters. Somewhere, an elderly woman secures her shutters against the cooling air, while murmuring one final prayer. None of these actions appears particularly mysterious. Then, almost casually, someone carries a coarse wooden bowl containing milk toward the doorstep. No announcement follows, no elaborate ceremony, no chanting. The bowl is simply placed outside. Then the door closes. From a modern perspective, we naturally ask the practical question: who exactly was expected to drink it? The medieval answer refuses to remain consistent. That inconsistency turns out to be one of history's most fascinating clues. Contrary to popular imagination, medieval Europeans did not all believe precisely the same things. Their religious lives resembled magnificent patchwork quilts stitched together over centuries. Official Christian teaching existed beside much older folk customs inherited from parents and grandparents. Local legends survived because they solved local problems. A priest might preach confidently on Sunday about proper Christian doctrine, while quietly avoiding arguments with elderly villagers who insisted that certain hills remained dangerous after sunset, because everyone knew who walked there. Belief, after all, rarely changes overnight. It accumulates, layer upon layer, generation after generation. Long before Christianity spread across Northern Europe, countless communities already believed the natural world overflowed with unseen personalities. Rivers possessed tempers. Forests contained inhabitants. Ancient trees deserved respect. Springs offered blessings. Certain rocks acquired reputations through stories repeated so often that questioning them became almost impolite. When Christianity gradually expanded throughout Europe, many of these older ideas did not vanish. They quietly changed clothes. Instead of abandoning familiar customs entirely, people often reinterpreted them. A protective spirit became an angel. A dangerous woodland being acquired more demonic characteristics. An ancestral guardian slowly merged with ideas about restless souls. The bowl of milk remained remarkably similar, even as explanations surrounding it evolved. History enjoys recycling habits while rewriting motivations. This helps explain why medieval church authorities occasionally found themselves issuing stern warnings about practices that sound almost charming today. Clergymen repeatedly complained that villagers continued making offerings at wells trees, crossroads stones, and household thresholds. Such complaints appear throughout sermons, church regulations, and pastoral writings because they represented genuine frustrations. If nobody continued these customs, nobody would have bothered condemning them. The persistence of these traditions reveals something surprisingly practical about ordinary medieval thinking. People generally preferred adding new beliefs rather than replacing old ones. If attending Mass might protect the soul, wonderful. If blessing the fields improved harvests, even better. If leaving milk outside happened to satisfy mysterious nighttime visitors, just in case they existed, why take unnecessary risks? From today's perspective, this reasoning resembles purchasing multiple insurance policies for disasters unlikely to occur. From their perspective, it resembled common sense. One forgotten harvest might mean starvation. One sick cow could destroy an entire family's survival. One failed winter threatened catastrophe, when existence itself balanced delicately upon whether livestock and harvests. Eliminating possible sources of bad fortune seemed remarkably reasonable. Modern people often smile at medieval superstition without recognizing how much certainty influences skepticism. Confidence grows comfortably inside stable societies. The less predictable daily life becomes, the more attractive rituals appear. Athletes develop lucky socks. Students insist particular pens improve examination results. Pilots preserve small habits before takeoff, despite understanding aviation engineering better than any medieval scholar could imagine. Human beings remain wonderfully talented at creating rituals whenever uncertainty refuses to disappear. The villagers who carried bowls of milk outside each evening were participating in precisely this timeless human instinct. Only their uncertainties happened to involve crop failures, wolves, plague, violent storms, unexplained illness, and long winter nights rather than delayed flights or internet connections. The offering itself varied according to local resources. Milk appeared frequently because cows represented prosperity, distilled into liquid form. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, making it simultaneously valuable and perishable. Offering even a modest amount demonstrated genuine generosity rather than symbolic theater. Bread appeared just as commonly because bread stood at the center of everyday existence. Entire economies rose and fell upon successful grain harvests. Bread nourished rich and poor alike, though admittedly in dramatically different qualities. Ale deserves special attention because modern audiences often misunderstand its place in medieval households. People did not necessarily drink ale because they wished to become intoxicated from sunrise onward, despite the enduring popularity of that humorous misconception. Small ale often contained relatively low alcohol levels while remaining safer than contaminated water sources. Brewing formed part of ordinary domestic life. Children drank diluted versions. Laborers refreshed themselves with it. Travelers depended upon it. Leaving a little ale outside therefore represented offering something genuinely woven into daily survival. It is oddly touching that medieval generosity toward invisible visitors relied not upon rare luxuries but ordinary necessities. Nobody imagined supernatural beings demanded exotic feasts every evening. A crust of bread, a little milk, perhaps a cup of ale, enough to acknowledge unseen neighbors without bankrupting visible families. Of course, no medieval custom remained entirely free from social observation. Imagine waking early one morning after forgetting to leave the customary offering outside. Perhaps nothing unusual happens immediately, yet neighbors notice remarkably small deviations within village life. Villages excel at observation. They function almost like living memory itself. Someone remembers that old Margaret always left bread by her doorstep. Someone else notices she forgot yesterday. Another recalls her cow becoming ill later that week. Before long, coincidence quietly transforms into evidence. Human communities specialize in connecting unrelated events. This habit has not disappeared. Only social media has accelerated it. Medieval villagers accomplished exactly the same process while standing beside wells instead of scrolling through phones. If livestock sickened shortly after neglected offerings, explanations emerged naturally. If storms damaged only one family's orchard, questions followed. Had they forgotten proper customs? Had someone offended unseen protectors? Had pride replaced humility? Notice how these explanations accomplished something psychologically important. They made random suffering feel negotiable. Randomness terrifies people. Cause and effect, even imaginary cause and effect, provide comfort. If misfortune follows forgotten rituals, then rituals provide hope. Random disasters offer no such reassurance. Some historians argue that these offerings primarily reflected hospitality extended beyond visible society. Medieval culture valued hospitality with extraordinary seriousness. Travelers depended upon strangers. Pilgrims crossed unfamiliar territories carrying little more than faith. Monasteries maintained guest halls because offering shelter represented Christian obligation. Families routinely shared food with unexpected visitors because tomorrow they themselves might become travelers needing identical generosity. Perhaps extending that hospitality toward unseen guests represented merely the logical conclusion of existing values. If kindness benefits strangers whose names remain unknown, why should invisible strangers receive different treatment? Whether spirits existed mattered less than demonstrating generosity. There is quiet elegance hidden within that possibility, yet not every nighttime visitor inspired warmth. Medieval folklore populated darkness with astonishing diversity. Helpful household beings occupied one category. Mischievous tricksters occupied another. Restless souls wandered under particular circumstances. Demonic forces tempted the unwary. Fair folk, depending upon region, ranged from benevolent neighbors to deeply unpredictable companions whose gifts required extraordinary caution. Leaving food outside sometimes reflected diplomacy rather than affection. One does not necessarily admire difficult neighbors. One simply prefers avoiding arguments. Villagers occasionally describe certain beings less as monsters than personalities possessing complicated expectations. They appreciated politeness. They disliked arrogance. They punished insults with embarrassing creativity, rather than spectacular violence. Milk might sour unexpectedly. Butter refused forming properly despite perfect weather. Bread dough stubbornly failed to rise. Chickens stopped laying eggs. None of these inconveniences required dramatic supernatural intervention. They merely resembled ordinary bad luck, interpreted through familiar cultural lenses. The remarkable feature is how modest these imagined punishments remained. Modern horror stories often escalate toward spectacular destruction. Medieval folklore usually remained stubbornly domestic. The supernatural interfered with laundry, with butter, with livestock, with missing tools, with creaking floors, with sleepless nights. In other words, exactly where ordinary people actually lived. Perhaps that explains why these stories survived so effectively. They felt believable because they occupied believable spaces. Nobody expected dragons inside kitchens, but everyone understood spoiled milk as evening settled across countless villages. The simple bowl waiting patiently beside a wooden doorway carried meanings far beyond its humble contents. It represented caution without panic, generosity without extravagance, tradition without requiring complete understanding. Children growing up within these households rarely question the practice, because customs become nearly invisible when repeated daily. A daughter watching her mother leave bread outside eventually performed the same action herself. A son, who once carried the bowl as a child, quietly continued after inheriting the family home decades later. That is often how history survives, not through famous documents, not through royal decrees, but through hands repeating small, familiar movements until nobody remembers exactly when they first began. And somewhere beyond the circle of firelight, while villages settled gradually into silence, beneath an enormous medieval sky, untouched bowls waited patiently upon worn wooden thresholds, offering quiet hospitality to whatever unseen guest might or might not pass by before the coming dawn. As twilight settled over another medieval village, the quiet rituals surrounding the beehives became even more revealing. The practical task of caring for bees slowly merged into something that resembled a conversation between two neighboring worlds. A beekeeper no longer approached the hive as a simple craftsman checking on livestock. He approached almost like someone visiting elderly relatives who deserved respect, patience, and careful words. It may sound wonderfully absurd to modern ears, but many Europeans genuinely believed bees possessed remarkable awareness. Not necessarily intelligence in the scholarly sense, but a mysterious sensitivity that allowed them to perceive changes hidden from ordinary human senses. This belief did not emerge overnight. Ancient writers had already described bees as unusually pure creatures. Medieval monks eagerly copied these texts, adding Christian symbolism along the way. Bees became examples of diligence, obedience, virginity sacrifice, and heavenly order. Every perfectly organized hive seemed to demonstrate how God intended society itself to function. A queen quietly ruled. Workers labored tirelessly. Each member accepted its place. No endless arguments, no lawsuits, no feuding noble families claiming the same pasture. For medieval observers, that alone bordered on miraculous. Watching thousands of insects cooperate with almost mathematical precision made many people suspect there had to be something spiritually significant happening inside those wax walls. The hive appeared almost too orderly to belong entirely to this imperfect world. Even monks who spent decades studying scripture frequently described bee colonies with language usually reserved for religious communities. Some monasteries compared their own disciplined lives to those of bees. Everyone worked, everyone contributed, everyone sacrificed personal comfort, everyone served a higher purpose. Of course, anyone who has accidentally disturbed a modern beehive might point out that bees are also quite capable of expressing strong opinions at extremely high speed. But medieval admiration tended to overlook that particular detail. Instead, people focused on the extraordinary consistency of bee society, while human kingdoms collapsed through greed, wars, betrayals, and inheritance disputes. A hive somehow continued functioning with astonishing stability. That stability inspired trust, and trust encouraged superstition. If creatures could maintain such perfect order, perhaps they also possessed knowledge unavailable to humans. Perhaps they recognized approaching storms before clouds appeared. Perhaps they sensed illness before symptoms emerged. Perhaps they detected invisible spirits wandering nearby. After all, animals already occupied an uncertain place in medieval thought. Dogs sometimes barked at unseen visitors. Owls announced misfortune. Ravens carried unsettling symbolism. Horses occasionally refused certain roads without obvious explanation. Cats earned both admiration and suspicion depending on local tradition. Why should bees be any different? Indeed, bees seemed even more mysterious because they vanished into flowers all day, then returned carrying invisible treasure transformed into liquid gold. Honey itself looked almost magical. No one watched nectar become honey. People observed only the beginning and the end. Flowers disappeared. Honey appeared. Wax appeared. Candles appeared. Medicine appeared. Sweetness appeared. The transformation seemed almost alchemical. If bees could perform that miracle every summer, perhaps understanding human emotions was not such an impossible leap. Many rural traditions insisted bees reacted noticeably to household events. A grieving family might notice unusual silence around the hive. Someone preparing for a wedding claimed the bees hummed more energetically. A prosperous harvest supposedly encouraged calmer colonies. Whether these observations reflected careful attention or selective memory mattered very little. Humans naturally search for patterns. Once enough stories accumulated, coincidence gradually transformed into certainty. Imagine losing a family member. You carefully informed the bees. The hive survived winter. Wonderful. Now imagine another family forgot to tell theirs. The colony died during cold weather. Clearly, people whispered the bees had taken offense. No one paused to ask whether disease parasites, starvation, damp conditions, or poor ventilation played a role. Those explanations lacked emotional satisfaction. Stories provide comfort because they connect unrelated events into meaningful narratives. The medieval world depended heavily upon such narratives. Scientific testing remained centuries away. Observation existed. Experience existed. Tradition existed. But carefully controlled experiments rarely entered ordinary village life. Instead, communities trusted accumulated wisdom. If our grandparents always told the bees, perhaps we should continue. That reasoning sounds surprisingly familiar. Modern families maintain countless traditions without remembering exactly why. Certain foods appear only on holidays. Certain chairs belong to particular relatives. Certain phrases are repeated every birthday. Many customs survive because abandoning them feels vaguely uncomfortable. Medieval bee traditions functioned in much the same way. Few villagers questioned them because questioning inherited wisdom carried social risks. If nothing bad happened after continuing the ritual, excellent. If disaster struck after abandoning it, everyone would know exactly whom to blame. Nobody wished to become the person who ignored the bees. Some regions even expanded the practice further. When ownership of property changed, the bees required introduction to their new caretaker. When a widow remarried, the bees deserved explanation. When children inherited farmland, the hives needed reassurance. These ceremonies quietly acknowledged something surprisingly sophisticated beneath the superstition. Bee colonies genuinely depend upon consistent care. New owners unfamiliar with proper management often lost valuable hives. By treating transitions ceremonially, communities encouraged continuity. The ritual itself reminded everyone that bees were not ordinary possessions to neglect after inheritance. They demanded ongoing relationships. In that sense, folklore accomplished practical education. Religion strengthened these beliefs further. Churches consumed astonishing quantities of beeswax candles. Unlike smoky tallow candles made from animal fat, beeswax burned cleanly and pleasantly. Its sweet fragrance suited sacred spaces. Its brighter flame symbolized divine purity. Masses, funerals, feast days, monasteries, cathedrals all depended upon wax. Without bees, medieval religious life literally became darker. Monasteries therefore invested serious effort into maintaining healthy apiaries. Some monks became remarkably skilled beekeepers. They documented hive management alongside prayers, herbal remedies, astronomy, and farming techniques. Reading such manuscripts today produces fascinating moments where careful agricultural advice suddenly shares a page with spiritual symbolism. Rotate the hive. Protect it from dampness. Watch for swarming. Remember that bees demonstrate God's perfect order. One sentence discusses ventilation. The next reflects eternal salvation. To medieval minds, these subjects complemented one another perfectly. Nature itself revealed divine lessons. Every creature carried symbolic meaning. Bees simply happened to carry more symbolism than most. Even legal records occasionally reveal the importance of hives. Bee theft appeared frequently enough to concern local authorities. Stealing a hive meant losing future honey wax and pollination. Punishments varied, but communities treated such crimes seriously. A thief stole not merely insects, but years of careful labor. Imagine attempting to explain this to someone today. I have been robbed. Oh no. Money. Worse. Jewelry. No. My bees. Depending on your neighborhood, reactions might differ considerably. Yet for medieval households, losing bees could genuinely threaten financial survival. Honey represented luxury. Wax represented income. Both products traveled through markets, reaching villages, monasteries, noble households, and towns. Successful beekeeping quietly supported entire local economies. That economic value only deepened emotional attachment. People protect what sustains them. Eventually, practical dependence becomes cultural affection. Cultural affection becomes folklore. Folklore becomes sacred tradition. And sacred tradition becomes something no one remembers inventing. By now, you may notice a recurring pattern running gently beneath nearly every medieval custom we have explored. What first appears irrational often hides practical experience. What appears supernatural frequently preserves useful behavior. And what appears charmingly strange usually reflects generations adapting to uncertain environments with whatever explanations made the most sense available to them. The bees, meanwhile, continued humming through all of it, blissfully unaware that they had somehow become respected neighbors, agricultural partners, religious symbols, family confidants, and unwilling participants in one of Europe's most enduring folk traditions. The quiet ritual of leaving milk bread or ale outside the door begins to make even more sense when we step away from the doorway itself and wander through the medieval village after sunset. During daylight, the settlement appears entirely ordinary. Chickens scratch beneath fences. Women carry buckets from the well. Blacksmiths hammer glowing iron children, chase one another between cottages, and merchants argue cheerfully over the price of wool or onions. But darkness changes the social landscape as dramatically as winter changes the fields. Once the sun disappears, the village becomes a place where certainty retreats and imagination quietly takes over. Modern people often underestimate how completely medieval nights belong to darkness. Even a cloudy evening today still glows faintly from electric lights scattered across cities many miles away. Medieval villagers knew nothing of such distant illumination. On moonless nights, stepping beyond one's own doorway could mean walking into nearly complete blackness. Familiar roads disappeared. Trees became towering silhouettes. Streams could only be heard rather than seen. Every distant movement invited interpretation before identification. The human brain has never enjoyed uncertainty. When vision weakens, imagination eagerly volunteers explanations. A swaying branch becomes a cloaked traveler. A wandering dog becomes something far less ordinary. An owl calling from the woods sounds strangely human. If one has already spent the evening hearing stories about wandering spirits. Medieval Europeans were no less intelligent than modern people. Their brains simply worked with different information and different expectations. Psychologists today describe a tendency called pattern recognition. Humans evolved to notice meaningful patterns because overlooking genuine danger carried greater risks than occasionally seeing connections where none existed. Better to mistake a shadow for a wolf than mistake a wolf for a harmless shadow. Medieval folklore amplified this natural instinct rather than suppressing it. Strange sounds, unexpected lights, unexplained illnesses, and unusual animal behavior all invited stories. Because stories transformed frightening uncertainty into understandable possibility. Within this atmosphere, the untouched bowl outside the house quietly became part of a larger conversation between the family and the unseen world. It was not merely food. It announced that the household understood the invisible etiquette governing nighttime existence. Just as one greeted neighbors politely during daylight, one acknowledged hidden presences after dark, through gestures of respect rather than direct conversation. One fascinating detail appearing throughout European folklore involves thresholds. Medieval people often regarded doorways as places possessing unusual symbolic importance. A threshold marked the exact point where safety ended and uncertainty began. Inside waited warmth, family familiar routines, and Christian prayers spoken around the hearth. Outside stretched forests, strangers changing weather, wandering animals, and whatever invisible beings popular tradition imagined sharing the landscape. Because thresholds occupied this symbolic middle ground, they attracted countless customs. Newly married couples crossed them together. Funeral processions paused before them. Protective herbs hung nearby. Horseshoes appeared above entrances in later centuries. Certain blessings focused specifically upon the doorway rather than the entire house. Leaving a bowl of food exactly at this boundary made perfect symbolic sense. It offered hospitality without inviting mysterious visitors directly inside. Ironically, medieval people often displayed remarkable caution regarding invitations. Stories repeatedly warned against carelessly inviting unknown forces across the household boundary. Hospitality required generosity, but also wisdom. Food could remain outside. Blessings could extend outward. Yet the family maintained careful control over who actually entered the home. This balance between openness and caution mirrors practical village life itself. Travelers deserved assistance, but unknown strangers were still questioned before sleeping beside the fire. Nighttime folklore also reflected medieval observations of ordinary wildlife. Foxes occasionally investigated unattended food. Cats wandered silently between houses. Hedgehogs searched gardens for insects. Small rodents emerged from hidden burrows beneath walls. Birds arrived surprisingly early before dawn. Families discovering subtle disturbances around the offering bowl naturally interpreted these signs through existing beliefs. Tiny footprints became evidence that invisible guests appreciated respectful treatment. What seems especially charming today is how rarely these stories demanded spectacular miracles. Household spirits seldom appeared surrounded by dramatic lights or terrifying noises. Instead, they behaved almost inconveniently ordinary. They accepted gifts quietly. They departed before sunrise. They preferred respectful anonymity. Medieval supernatural tradition often resembled difficult neighbors rather than theatrical monsters. This understated quality reveals something profound about village psychology. The goal was never excitement. Medieval people did not seek thrilling encounters with mysterious beings. On the contrary, they hoped life remained pleasantly uneventful. Healthy livestock, peaceful nights, successful harvests, obedient weather, and sleeping children represented genuine happiness. Invisible guardians fit comfortably into this worldview because their greatest achievement consisted of preventing disaster rather than creating spectacle. Church records occasionally preserve frustrated complaints from clergy attempting to discourage precisely these quiet customs. Priests understood that villagers continued older practices not because they rejected Christianity, but because inherited traditions felt emotionally reassuring. Sermons could condemn superstition repeatedly, yet grandmothers' habits often survived theological correction. After all, abandoning familiar rituals seemed unnecessarily risky if generations believed they had quietly protected the household. This tension produced fascinating compromises. Instead of abandoning offerings entirely, some families gradually reinterpreted them. Food left outside might honor wandering souls awaiting God's mercy, rather than older household spirits. Milk could symbolize Christian charity, rather than pagan hospitality. Ancient customs acquired newer explanations while preserving familiar behavior. Cultural evolution rarely erases traditions completely. More often, it patiently changes their meanings. The household hearth itself reinforced these layered beliefs. Fire represented one of humanity's oldest companions, providing warmth, cooking, protection, and social gathering. Medieval evenings revolved almost entirely around its flickering light. Stories naturally flourished within this setting because conversation replaced written entertainment for most ordinary people. Children learned family history, local legends, religious lessons, seasonal wisdom, and practical advice, while watching flames dance across smoke-darkened beams overhead. Imagine sitting beside such a fire during late autumn. Outside, the wind rattles loose branches against the roof. Rain taps softly upon thatch. Someone mentions hearing unusual sounds near the old oak tree several nights earlier. Another remembers how an uncle forgot to leave milk outside before losing 3 sheep the following week. No one claims absolute certainty, yet every story quietly strengthens communal memory. Belief grows not through dramatic proof, but through repeated conversation shared across countless peaceful evenings. Modern readers sometimes imagine folklore as rigid systems, everyone accepted unquestioningly. Reality appears far more flexible. Medieval villagers probably disagreed constantly about details. One family insisted offerings pleased ancestral spirits. Another preferred household guardians. Someone else dismissed both explanations, but continued participating anyway, because it certainly does no harm. Such practical uncertainty characterizes human belief remarkably well across history. Economic realities also shape these customs. Wealthier households could occasionally afford larger offerings, yet folklore rarely suggested generosity depended upon quantity. A modest piece of coarse bread carried greater symbolic value than extravagant waste. Spirits, much like idealized saints in Christian teaching, supposedly recognize sincere intention rather than impressive display. This principle made comforting psychological sense. Even poor families could participate meaningfully without impossible sacrifice. Interestingly, medieval hospitality traditions extended beyond supernatural expectations into relationships with actual travelers. Pilgrims crossing Europe often relied entirely upon local generosity for survival. Roads remained dangerous weather, unpredictable, and distances exhausting. Many households offered simple meals, despite possessing little themselves. The invisible guest receiving milk outside, and the weary traveler receiving bread beside the fire, belonged to surprisingly similar moral universes. Both represented vulnerable outsiders, deserving measured kindness. Folk beliefs surrounding luck further reinforced these habits. Medieval fortune rarely appeared random. Success usually reflected proper relationships with God, neighbors, seasons, animals, ancestors, and unseen forces inhabiting the landscape. Every action either strengthened or weakened these invisible connections. Forgetting an offering, therefore, seemed less like breaking an arbitrary rule and more like neglecting an important friendship. Nature itself seemed to cooperate with these interpretations. Bees returned faithfully each spring. Birds migrated mysteriously before winter. Certain flowers opened only at specific hours. Mushrooms appeared overnight after rainfall. Seeds vanished into dark soil before emerging months later, transformed into food. Medieval Europeans observed countless natural processes they understood only partially. Invisible spiritual explanations comfortably filled these gaps without appearing irrational within their broader worldview. Perhaps the greatest irony lies in recognizing how profoundly these customs encouraged mindfulness. Preparing the small offering forced families to pause briefly before sleep and acknowledge dependence upon a world larger than themselves. Whether that larger world consisted of God's Spirit's ancestors' fortune or simply unpredictable nature mattered less than cultivating humility. The bowl quietly reminded everyone that human control remained incomplete. As another night settled across fields and forests, the untouched offering rested patiently beneath starlight, while its owner slept behind heavy wooden doors. They could not know whether invisible visitors noticed the gift, whether foxes would sniff curiously nearby, or whether morning would bring ordinary peace or unexpected hardship. Yet perhaps certainty was never the true purpose. The ritual itself allowed ordinary people facing uncertain lives to believe they had extended one final gesture of courtesy toward a mysterious universe before surrendering themselves to sleep. As centuries passed, the quiet custom of leaving food outside after sunset began changing almost as slowly as the weathered beams of the cottages themselves. Traditions rarely disappear in dramatic moments. They fade softly, borrowing new meanings while quietly abandoning old ones. A grandmother continues the ritual because her own mother insisted upon it. Her grandchildren repeat it because refusing feels strangely uncomfortable, even if they can no longer explain exactly who the milk is meant for. In this way, medieval Europe became filled with customs whose origins rested so deeply beneath everyday life that almost no one could remember where they had first begun. This gradual forgetting is one of history's favorite habits. People rarely wake one morning and collectively decide to invent folklore. Instead, practical actions slowly gather stories around them until the stories become inseparable from the actions themselves. Perhaps generations earlier, someone genuinely believed invisible household guardians appreciated fresh milk. A century later, the explanation shifted toward wandering souls. Another century passed, and the offering became little more than the proper thing to do. By then, abandoning the custom felt more unsettling than continuing it. One of the most revealing features of medieval village life is how rarely practical behavior and supernatural belief competed with one another. Modern thinking often separates logic from folklore, as though individuals must choose one side or the other. Medieval villagers lived far more comfortably inside both worlds simultaneously. A farmer understood perfectly well that healthy cattle required clean water and sufficient pasture. That same farmer might also quietly whisper a blessing before releasing them into spring fields, because practical care and spiritual caution seemed entirely compatible. The bowl outside the doorway belonged to this blended understanding of reality. Leaving bread for unseen visitors did not replace careful farming-wise food storage or hard labor. It simply addressed another layer of existence that seemed equally real. If weather, illness, and harvest already depended upon countless invisible forces beyond human control, acknowledging those forces appeared sensible rather than irrational. This attitude becomes easier to understand when we remember how astonishingly little control medieval people possessed over everyday outcomes. A modern household worried about spoiled milk purchases another bottle. A medieval family losing its only dairy cow could face genuine hunger throughout the coming winter. Modern roofs leak into insurance claims. Medieval roofs collapsing beneath heavy snow threatened survival itself. Small misfortunes accumulated enormous consequences. When uncertainty dominates daily life rituals, become surprisingly practical emotional tools. Even if an offering changed nothing physically, it changed something psychologically. It allowed families to believe they had done everything reasonably possible before surrendering events to fate, God, weather, or whatever invisible powers govern tomorrow. The quiet satisfaction of having fulfilled every known responsibility remains comforting today, even in entirely different circumstances. Children probably absorb this lesson more deeply than adults realized. Watching parents carefully prepare a tiny gift for unseen visitors taught several values simultaneously. Respect mattered. Gratitude mattered. Generosity mattered. Humility mattered. The world extended beyond immediate human desires. Even if children later abandoned supernatural interpretations, these broader lessons often survived. Many folk tales describing neglected offerings reveal fascinating moral priorities. Misfortune rarely strikes, because spirits behave randomly or cruelly. Instead, disaster follows pride, carelessness, selfishness, or mockery. A farmer laughs openly at old customs before losing livestock. A wealthy household refuses to share food despite enjoying abundant harvests. Someone deliberately insults invisible neighbors out of arrogance. Medieval storytelling repeatedly transforms supernatural punishment into moral education. This pattern appears across countless cultures because stories often function less as historical records than ethical instruction. Whether spirits literally punished stingy households mattered less than encouraging generosity within tightly connected rural communities. A family known for refusing hospitality damaged more than its own reputation. In villages where cooperation determined survival, selfish behavior threatened everyone indirectly. Even church leaders who criticized certain folk traditions usually supported the virtues hiding beneath them. Charity, kindness, humility, hospitality, and gratitude remain thoroughly Christian values regardless of questionable folklore surrounding household spirits. Consequently, popular customs sometimes survive precisely because they reinforced desirable behavior, even if official explanations shifted toward more acceptable theology. Seasonal festivals strengthen these overlapping traditions. During harvest celebrations, winter feasts, or saints' days, communities gathered around shared meals, emphasizing abundance after months of labor. Extra bread or ale naturally found its way toward travelers, the poor monastery guests, neighboring families, and occasionally the mysterious nighttime offering beyond the doorway. Generosity expanded outward in widening circles until visible and invisible recipients occupied remarkably similar symbolic positions. The medieval landscape itself encouraged such thinking. Forests remained vast and only partially explored. Marshes concealed dangerous ground beneath peaceful reeds. Mountains changed weather with startling speed. Rivers flooded unexpectedly. Travelers disappeared along lonely roads. Entire communities understood that much of the natural world remained beyond complete human understanding. Folklore simply populated these uncertain spaces with personalities rather than empty randomness. Night amplified every one of these uncertainties. Darkness blurred familiar boundaries until imagination supplied missing details. Yet surprisingly, medieval folklore often emphasized coexistence rather than constant conflict. Invisible beings preferred respectful distance. Humans offered courtesy. Both sides avoided unnecessary confrontation. The relationship resembled neighboring households, maintaining peaceful boundaries instead of permanent warfare. This quiet coexistence perhaps explains why offerings usually remain modest. Medieval villagers did not construct elaborate shrines or perform extravagant ceremonies every evening. They placed simple food outside almost casually, then returned indoors to ordinary family life. Such restraint suggests confidence rather than desperation. The ritual belonged alongside locking the door, banking the fire, checking livestock, and saying evening prayers. It became another small habit, preparing the household for sleep. There is something deeply human about this rhythm. Every civilization develops bedtime routines, extending beyond immediate physical necessity. We dim lights, brush teeth, check locks, arrange pillows, silence devices, or read familiar pages before closing our eyes. Medieval evenings followed different patterns, but served identical psychological purposes. Repeated actions gently signaled that wakefulness had ended, and vulnerability could safely begin. One particularly touching aspect of these traditions concerns grief. In several European regions, households experiencing recent bereavement displayed heightened concern for invisible visitors. The boundary between living and dead seemed unusually delicate following a funeral. Offerings outside the house, prayers inside, and quiet conversations about departed relatives blended naturally together. Medieval mourning often remained communal rather than private, allowing folklore to provide comforting language where certainty proved impossible. Imagine an elderly widow quietly placing fresh milk outside only weeks after losing her husband. Whether she believed household spirits protected the home, ancestral souls lingered nearby, or simple tradition honored generations before her, mattered almost less than the act itself. The ritual acknowledged continuity despite personal loss. Life remained connected to both memory and hope. Archaeologists rarely uncovered direct evidence for such customs because bowls, bread, and milk leave remarkably little trace after centuries. Historians instead pieced together fragments from sermons complaining about superstitions, court records mentioning unusual practices, folk songs preserving symbolic references, later oral traditions, and scattered household accounts. Like many aspects of everyday medieval life, these rituals survive indirectly through people attempting either to preserve them or eliminate them. This absence of dramatic evidence creates an interesting irony. Medieval kings' battles and cathedrals dominate written history because powerful institutions generated abundant records. Ordinary villagers leaving bowls of milk beneath moonlit skies rarely employed scribes. Consequently, some of the most intimate details of daily life nearly vanished altogether. Recovering them requires careful listening to whispers rather than declarations. Perhaps that is precisely why these forgotten customs continue fascinating modern audiences. They reveal history not through crowns or swords, but through tiny gestures repeated quietly by millions of anonymous people whose names disappeared centuries ago. Their worries resemble ours surprisingly often. They hoped loved ones remained safe. They feared uncertain futures. They sought peaceful sleep despite unpredictable worlds. They invented small rituals, helping fragile hearts believe tomorrow might arrive kindly. By the time dawn finally crept across the eastern horizon, the bowl outside the medieval cottage had completed its silent work, regardless of whether any invisible guest had approached it during the night. The offering represented trust, extended into darkness itself. It reminded the sleeping household that kindness cost little, compared with regret that respect required fewer resources than arrogance, and that some mysteries deserved courtesy even when complete understanding remained forever beyond human reach. Eventually, the centuries carried these quiet customs away, not through dramatic prohibition or sudden enlightenment, but through the slow transformation of everyday life itself. Villages expanded into towns, roads became safer, scientific explanations gradually replaced inherited assumptions. Glass windows grew larger, homes became brighter. Printed books spread new ideas, and generations slowly forgot why a grandmother once insisted that a bowl of milk should never be left empty on certain nights. Yet the disappearance of the custom did not erase the way of thinking that had created it. It simply changed its clothing, The most remarkable discovery hidden beneath this forgotten tradition is not whether invisible beings truly wandered medieval villages. History cannot answer that question, and perhaps it was never meant to. The real story lies in what ordinary people believed about themselves, their homes, and the unseen relationships connecting every corner of their world. To a medieval family, a house was never just timber, clay, and thatch. It was a living place with memory. Every beam had been raised by familiar hands. Every stone surrounding the hearth had absorbed years of conversation. Children learned to walk across its earthen floor. Elderly relatives took their final breaths beneath its roof. Bread was baked there through winters both harsh and generous. Newborn infants cried there before receiving baptism. The house accumulated not merely possessions, but human life itself. It is hardly surprising that people imagine such places attracting more than human attention. Modern architecture often emphasizes efficiency. Medieval homes emphasized continuity. Generations frequently occupied the same buildings, cultivating the same fields, drinking from the same wells, and burying relatives within walking distance of the front door. Past, present, and future overlapped constantly. Ancestors never felt entirely absent because reminders of them surrounded daily life. The old pear tree had been planted by a grandfather. The wooden chest belonged to a great-grandmother. The boundary between memory and presence naturally became softer than many modern people experience today. Leaving food outside after sunset quietly acknowledged this continuity. Whether intended for protective household spirits, wandering souls, mysterious fair folk, or simply inherited custom, the offering declared that life extended beyond immediate human perception. Medieval Europeans rarely imagined themselves standing alone against the universe. Instead, they pictured existence as a vast web of visible and invisible relationships requiring careful maintenance. Curiously, modern society has not escaped this instinct nearly as completely as it sometimes believes. People still leave flowers beside roads where strangers died decades earlier. Families still prepare favorite meals on anniversaries of departed relatives. Some quietly greet old family homes before selling them. Sailors continue respecting ancient maritime superstitions despite sophisticated navigation systems. Theater performers avoid speaking certain words backstage. Athletes repeat personal rituals before important competitions. Travelers carry lucky coins. Parents kiss sleeping children in exactly the same way every evening, without calculating whether the habit produces measurable results. Humans remain wonderfully ritualistic creatures. Perhaps rituals survive because they organize emotions more effectively than facts alone ever can. Facts explain how storms form. Rituals help frightened people endure the storm. Facts explain disease. Rituals comfort families waiting beside the sick. Facts explain agriculture. Rituals reassure farmers watching dark clouds gather above precious crops. The medieval bowl of milk belonged to this emotional architecture. It provided a tiny island of certainty inside an unpredictable existence. Even if tomorrow's weather remained unknowable, tonight's offering had been made. The family had fulfilled its part of the silent agreement with the mysterious world beyond the doorstep. One cannot help smiling gently at the practical irony. Many historians suspect foxes, cats, hedgehogs, mice, and countless ordinary animals probably enjoyed far more of these nighttime offerings than supernatural visitors ever did. Yet perhaps that possibility would not have greatly troubled medieval villagers. After all, feeding hungry creatures hardly contradicted ideals of charity. The fox departed with a full stomach. The family slept peacefully, believing kindness had been shown. The village remained generous. Everyone benefited. History often contains these beautiful accidental harmonies. Another forgotten lesson hides inside the remarkable modesty of the offering itself. No extravagant sacrifice was required. No enormous temple needed construction. No costly pilgrimage demanded completion. Only a little bread, a little milk, perhaps a cup of ale, enough to acknowledge gratitude without creating hardship. The custom quietly celebrated balance rather than excess. That idea appears repeatedly throughout medieval rural life. Survival depended upon moderation. Grain had to last until spring. Firewood required careful management through winter. Livestock could not be overworked. Fields demanded years of recovery between crops. Everything existed within delicate limits. Even generosity flourished most successfully when practiced consistently instead of dramatically. The villagers who performed these small nighttime rituals would probably find modern life astonishing. They would marvel at houses glowing brightly throughout the night, at food preserved effortlessly for weeks, at windows larger than entire cottage walls, at roads carrying strangers faster than any horse, at people communicating instantly across oceans. And perhaps after sufficient amazement faded, they would ask a surprisingly simple question. Do these extraordinary comforts make people feel less uncertain about tomorrow? The answer, of course, is complicated. Modern anxieties wear different clothing than medieval fears. We worry about deadlines rather than harvest failures, traffic instead of wolves, emails instead of wandering pilgrims, insurance instead of hailstorms. Yet beneath every technological achievement remains the same fragile human heart, hoping tomorrow arrives kindly. The medieval family, placing bread outside before sleep, and the modern person checking tomorrow's weather forecast before bed are separated by centuries, but united by something deeper. Both are attempting in their own ways to negotiate with uncertainty. Perhaps that explains why forgotten customs continue capturing our imagination. Not because we secretly believe invisible spirits still wait beyond our doors, but because we recognize ourselves inside the people who once did. Their fears seem strange, their solutions seem stranger, yet their longing for safety feels completely familiar. History has an extraordinary talent for shrinking the distance between centuries. At first, medieval villagers appear almost unimaginably different. They whisper to bees, warn children not to whistle after dark, cover mirrors after death, share beds with strangers, leave bowls of milk for unseen guests. Then, little by little, the strangeness softens. Each custom reveals another recognizable human hope. To protect family, to understand loss, to welcome kindness, to survive another winter, to believe the world contains more generosity than danger. Eventually, the offering resting quietly outside the cottage no longer seems ridiculous. It simply feels human. As the centuries drift silently behind us, the bowl disappears. The bread returns to dust. The milk soaks gently into forgotten earth. The cottage itself slowly collapses beneath rain moss and passing seasons. The people who placed those offerings are gone, their names forgotten, their voices silent, their fears dissolved into history. Yet somewhere beneath all the layers of time, one can almost imagine a peaceful medieval evening, settling once again across a tiny village. A wooden door closes softly. The fire glows warmly inside. A small bowl rests patiently beneath the stars. No one waits to see who comes. No one demands proof. The gesture itself is enough. And perhaps that is the quiet wisdom history leaves beside our own doorstep tonight. Not that every mystery must be solved. Not that every old belief deserves ridicule. But that ordinary people living ordinary lives have always searched for gentle ways to make peace with the darkness beyond the door. Now the village has fallen completely silent. The wind moves softly through distant trees. The last candle is burned low. Even the stories themselves grow quieter, fading like footsteps across an ancient village lane, until they disappear into the calm embrace of the night. So let your own thoughts become just as quiet. Let the worries of today drift away like smoke rising from a medieval hearth into the endless evening sky. The unseen visitors of history have finished their journey. The little bowl waits peacefully beneath the stars. The house is warm, the door is safely closed, and the long, remarkable story of ordinary people finding comfort in extraordinary beliefs can finally rest, just as perhaps you can now do the same.